So what I'm really focusing on is climate change and the implications for MSF. So this last year was the hottest year on record, and it's the last 16 of the last 17 years have been the hottest years on record since records were kept as of 1850. So I'm not going to go into the deep science, if you will, of meteorology and climate change. I'm assuming that is an accepted fact. The world has fundamentally changed. The world order that we knew prior to the election last fall is no more. Donald Trump has fundamentally altered the very nature of the Western international liberal order. That order is in question. We are at a point in our human history where we have multiple poles of competing power internationally. The United Nations system formed after World War II with a view to building a multilateral agenda that would sustain peace. That system is very much in question. This was a tweet by Fareed Zakaria 2 days ago. And here he said this could be the day when Donald Trump withdraws the United States from the Paris Climate Accord. Zakaria said this could be the day the U.S. resigns as leader of the free world. And he wasn't kidding. The other big issue is that in a post-9/11 world, we are seeing, according to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, we are seeing now a systematic unraveling of human rights protections and international humanitarian law norms, standards, and practices. There are many factors that are driving this, but functionally and operationally, this is a new reality. And I think this is not something that is unknown to MSF. Even if we were able to reduce all greenhouse gas emissions to zero as of tomorrow, the immediate and, at least for the foreseeable 15-year period, effects of climate change will continue to be felt and will continue to accelerate, at least for the next 15 years. So Louis Pasteur, who many in the room I'm sure will be familiar with, one of his great and best aphorisms was, chance favors the prepared mind. So my comments are very much about thinking about what is climate change doing now, and what will it be doing in the future in terms of implications for MSF. So what is absolutely clear is that climate change is affecting the poorest countries the most severely, and the people who are doing the least to cause it are in fact those who are suffering the most. This map illustrates very clearly the massive differences in impacts of climate change. This is a chart that demonstrates the incidence of natural disasters from 1950 all the way up to 2016. And what you see is a massive increase in the number of natural disasters. And this is very much consistent with climate change. Climate change is responsible for a massive increase in extreme weather events, a massive increase in emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, which we'll hear about a little later on. This is an image of an MSF team in Malawi dealing with a cholera outbreak last year. When we think of infectious diseases, we shouldn't simply think of malaria. We should think of malaria, dengue fever, schistosomiasis, cholera, and a whole range of other infectious diseases, most of which are vector-borne, not all of which are vector-borne. And of course, massive increases in waterborne infectious diseases. We're also seeing massive increases in food insecurity. In 2011, there was a massive famine across East Africa and the Horn of Africa. 13 million people were affected. MSF is familiar with this. 500,000 people died in that famine. This was directly attributed to anthropogenic climate change. There's solid, irrefutable scientific evidence for this. The other big issue that is often neglected when we think about climate change is what I call issues that emerge in complex ecologies. Ebola was not itself directly attributable to climate change, but in the face of massive population increase, in the face of decreasing public health infrastructure, in the face of a post-war, post-conflict region where trust in government and government capacity to deliver public health and clinical health services was diminished, and in the face of increasing ecological impingement, we had a population that was exposed to Ebola. And in that context, with the variables that I've just described, we had a massive spread of an infectious disease that was obviously a regional threat that MSF is deeply aware of, and was also a global health threat that was contained through the efforts of MSF and many others. But I would venture to say largely MSF. The other big factor that we see with climate change is a worsening dynamic between climate change and fragile states. We see interactions between war and displacement, food insecurity, and emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. This is exactly what is happening now in the 4 famines of 2017, where 20 million people, as we speak, are facing famine, and where there is a massive humanitarian response, and a response that is recognized by many within the humanitarian system as woefully inadequate, and one that illuminates that that system is in fact at its breaking point. The capacity of our existing humanitarian system and of our existing humanitarian architecture to deal with existing needs that emerge around natural disasters, emerging, re-emerging infectious diseases, food insecurity, and state insecurity. That capacity is already taxed beyond its ability to cope. We also see some of the factors that are at play here have been identified by the G7, and they basically identify 7 factors that suggest that climate change is a risk multiplier in fragile states. I'm not going to go through these in any great detail, but in short, we see that conflict over natural resources, an increased risk of migration crises, natural disasters, food insecurity again, water management disputes, rising sea levels, and unintended negative consequences of some climate policies and aid programs are in fact massive risk multipliers that create increasing and I would argue overwhelming humanitarian need. The other key thing I think that's really important to understand is that there are 2 other big variables that are very much at play. One is population increase, and the other is urbanization. We are now at 7.4 billion people on the planet. We are adding 1 billion people every 13 years to the planet. The carrying capacity of the planet, the carrying capacity of our governance structures, the carrying capacity of our social structures is very much taxed beyond its limit. The other big phenomenon is urbanization. We are now at 54% of the human population lives in urban environments. 150 years ago, that was less than 20%. By 2030, it will be 74% of the human population will live in urban environments. That's a very, very short period of time where the coalescence of human populations into massive concentrations poses particular risks for health and well-being, and particularly in the context of the other variables that I have talked about, this is a major, major issue. Davos releases a global risk report every year. Now, Davos is certainly not the kind of place that I like to hang out. I've never been there. But their risk report is stellar. It's fantastic. It's well recognized by experts all over the world as one of the best risk analyses. Last year, their risk analysis suggested that the top 5 risks for the next 10 years are water crises, failure of climate mitigation and adaptation, extreme weather events, food crises, and profound social instability. that these portend significant risk for global political instability. Well, I would argue that we are already very much moving in that direction. The other big issue that I want to point out is that climate change is a significant risk multiplier in very particular contexts. Now, we think of Syria as primarily a migration crisis and as a migration crisis secondary to civil war and secondary to regional instability, all of which is true. But if you do a causal analysis and look back over time and do a timeline sequence analysis, one of the critical events, if not the critical catalytic event that set off the instability in Syria was a drought. Drought in the northern part of Syria caused movement of people from one part of the country to another into cities of a different ethnic and religious affiliation, destabilized an already fragile political system, and catalyzed a civil war, and now that has conflated with regional conflict and regional crisis. Now, I'm not suggesting that climate change is the causal variable. I am suggesting that it is a causal variable that we can no longer ignore, and that MSF, as an organization, has to think about and has to have it as part of its overall analytic toolbox. So conflict now is regional, it's borderless, it's porous, and it has global impacts. I don't need to explain that to this group. We now have 65 million internally displaced people and refugees, more than any time since World War II. We live in a world that some call VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Some of the factors that are outlined here I've already described in a little bit more detail. In 2016, 125 million people needed humanitarian assistance. Only 87 million were able to get assistance. So that, and of those people who got assistance, they got less than half of the material assistance that they required in order to maintain a sustainable or viable means of existence. We also saw a $20.1 billion shortfall in funding for UN funded humanitarian assistance. If you look at this chart here, 2004, there's a little gap between the white line and the red line. Well, as we get to 2016, that gap is massive. At 2004, the gap was in the hundreds of millions, and now the gap is $20.1 billion. So only less than half of the required humanitarian assistance that was requested by UN agencies was actually funded. Now, the ICRC last year said, and I'm going to read this, ICRC and other impartial humanitarian organizations are facing humanitarian needs on an epic scale in an unprecedented number of concurrent crises around the world. The gap between those needs and the ability of the humanitarian actors to meet them is impossible to bridge. The international humanitarian sector is at risk of reaching a breaking point. Concern said exactly the same thing only 2 months ago in relationship to the 4 famines. So let's look at what sort of things MSF might need to do or might need to think about in the future. Well, I would argue that there are really 2 categories. There are tactical and there are strategic choices that MSF needs to make. Tactically, I think MSF needs to become much more aware and much more competent in understanding the complex reality and the complex nature of the interactions that I have just described. There is a group, which I'm part of, that is looking at climate change and health modeling and that takes into consideration the kind of factors that I have just described. And there are many other similar initiatives that are well worth looking at. And this is an area of expertise that MSF can both contribute to and benefit from. The other major issue that MSF needs to, I think, continue to do is in the face of massive increases of humanitarian need in the kind of context and the kind of contexts that I have talked about, and the kind of complexity that I've talked about. MSF needs to even more rigorously uphold the norms that safeguard humanity. And this means really strong, engaged advocacy around the responsibility of nation states primarily to respect international humanitarian law. The other big issue that MSF, I think, needs to think about strategically is risk management partnerships. The kind of complexity that I've talked about is well beyond the capacity of any one organization to take on. So the kind of thinking that is required is a new kind of thinking. It has to be very much about risk management, and that really is about working in partnership with others. And that, I would argue, would be a stronger, even stronger partnerships with organizations like ICRC, the appropriate medical humanitarian NGOs, UN multilateral agencies. Faith-based organizations are now absolutely critical in the delivery of humanitarian assistance in many parts of the world. And MSF, I think, needs to have a much more open and much more engaged relationship with those operational partners. Also with communities at a community-based care delivery level, and then also with diasporic communities. Diasporic communities are extremely important in terms of funding for people in need. And MSF should also, I think, be looking at better tools around, for example, healthcare technologies, whether these are drugs, diagnostics, vaccines, digital tools for delivery of healthcare, and then tools for cash transfers from population to population. MSF, I think, could and should play a role in that regard. In terms of humanitarian assistance, MSF is very good at humanitarian assistance, no question about it. I've already made the point that I think MSF needs to even further step up its advocacy role, but I think MSF has to very much think about engaging very, very seriously and significantly, not simply on assistance, but also on protection. MSF does do protection, or does engage at least in some legal issues and some legal advocacy around protection. But I think protection is the #1 need of internally displaced people and refugees and migrants. It is an area where there's a paucity of expertise, where humanitarian assistance has become very technical, very kind of logico-deductive and very specific in terms of technical requirements. The protection issue is fundamental. And I think there are very few organizations, if not, I would even venture to say, there's no other organization that can play the role that MSF can play in advocating for better protection of internally displaced and refugee people. The final area that MSF, I think, needs to really think a lot about is natural disasters. Natural disasters, if you remember my graph, natural disasters are on the massive increase, and over the next 15 years, even with a perfect world of zero greenhouse gas emissions, the follow-on effects of existing climate change are such that we will continue to see increases in natural disasters. So this is a huge area where there are massive current needs and future needs, and I think MSF has a capacity and a responsibility to engage that. There are other issues here that I won't go into. The final point is the humanitarian architecture. Last year, there was a summit in Istanbul, and I believe MSF very rightly pulled out of that summit. I know it was very, very contentious, and a lot of effort had gone into MSF's work to participate in that summit. And I know internally there was great turmoil, and many people were very upset, and also many people were very pleased. My opinion, I believe MSF made absolutely the right choice. This summit, in my view, was a colossal and massive failure. It was a missed opportunity. This was the place, this was the time where it was possible to consider actually a critical examination of the humanitarian architecture from a post-World War II period through to today, and a critical examination of whether or not that architecture is adequate or fit for purpose given the kind of 21st century context that I and many others have described. Climate change is a critical variable in understanding the nature of need and the nature of response. And this was an opportunity to engage not simply the issue of climate change from a humanitarian perspective, but more importantly, the issue of the humanitarian architecture and is it fit for purpose. And I believe that MSF, having taken the firm position that it took last year, is now in a position to take a leadership role in examining and engaging in a critical examination of that humanitarian architecture. Is it fit for purpose, and what kind of new approaches and new strategies, given issues like climate change, does that architecture need to have in order to meet, even to have a remote possibility of meeting the scale of need that exists? Sometimes people like these little graphs. I'm arguing then, here's the core argument, with increased greenhouse gas emissions, with increased population, urbanization, and state fragility, plus decreased governance, so a change in the geopolitical architecture, plus decreased money for humanitarian assistance, plus decreased humanitarian assistance and protection capacity. This equals a circumstance where MSF has to recognize the changing scale of need that exists in the world, and it needs to adjust the scope of its activity.